My challenge was to read The Mayflower by Nathaniel Philbrick. Is that how you pronounce it? And this is Des. She's the one that gave me the challenge. And I actually really enjoy this book. It's all about history, and I love history. Being English, we know about the Mayflower when it gets here, but we don't really talk about what happens to the people in America and how it all developed. So reading this really was an eye-opener, and I had quite a few questions that I would like to ask Des because I wasn't sure about these. So the first question is, why was the Mayflower so important when there was already people living in Jamestown and surrounding areas?
Mayflower was important mostly because of the group of people that was on the Mayflower. Jamestown and surrounding areas were developed more for people who wanted to get rich. They wanted wealth. They were looking for, gold and those kinds of things. But one of the groups of people on the Mayflower, they were actually looking for religious freedom, which they did not have in England. They had been forced out of England in the early 1600s and had gone to Holland because Holland did have religious freedom. And so it's because of that one little group of people that they were looking for, they weren't looking for wealth, they were looking more for religious freedom.
Okay, thank you. Why is the Plymouth Rock important? It talked about the Plymouth Rock, and then I spoke to some other people, and I'm like, they showed me a picture, and I giggled because it's very small. And apparently over the years that it's been chiseled away and people want to take a bit. But why was it important at that time, the Plymouth Rock?
Plymouth Rock wasn't important. In fact, it's kind of one of these founding myths, you might call them. The idea of Plymouth Rock, so when they landed on the beach in Plymouth, it was December, it would have been very cold. The last thing they probably wanted to do was get out of one of these small rowboats and get their feet wet and into the water. So if they would have had a rock that was sticking out into the water that they could have gotten out of the little rowboats and walked onto dry land safely and without getting wet, that would have been preferable. However, we don't know if it really happened because nobody ever wrote about it from the time period of the Pilgrims. They never ever wrote about this big rock that they all got off, And so it's one of those things that we don't know. Could there have been a rock? Yeah, there could have been. In fact, there was this enormous rock on the beach. But did they use it? Was it sticking out in the water? It's one of history's mysteries. We don't know. We don't know. So
okay, that made me laugh a bit when I saw the size of the rock.
It's tiny. It's like a little bit bigger than a student desk. It is not very big, but 150 years ago, it was much, much larger. And this story started of Plymouth Rock, and so people literally would go down to the beach and chisel off a chunk of the rock and say, "Oh, I've got a piece of the Plymouth Rock," and yeah, it's malarkey.
Originally, the Mayflower was supposed to go to Hudson River.
Yes.
But due to the weather conditions, they ended up at Cape Cod area.
Yes.
If they had stuck to the original plan, would there be Thanksgiving? And would it have shaped the US?
I would say no. The idea of Thanksgiving, it was a harvest festival. And cultures all up and down usually did have a harvest festival, usually late September, early October. It was never in November.
We still celebrate that in England. We still have harvest festivals in September. And we have it at schools, and you have to bring things in. Yes, we still do that.
So it was the same idea. It was a harvest festival. They combined it because the Wampanoag Native Americans were so critical in their survival with helping them to learn how to plant these crops in very sandy soil. Of course, they felt like it was appropriate to invite the Native Americans to come to this. And so if they would have ended up in the Hudson Bay, there probably would not be a first Thanksgiving, really. We would have more of harvest festivals at different time periods, but it was because of this thing. Now, the actual idea of Thanksgiving actually became a national holiday with Abraham Lincoln. He was the one who started this time of Thanksgiving, and it was right after, or it was soon after the Battle of Gettysburg that he started that.
Okay. The Pilgrims traveled to Boston area, and they realized that there could have been a much better place to settle due to the harbor and river. It was easier for the Mayflower to go in
To Boston.
Yeah, but they said, no, we're better off being back in Plymouth because we've got our homes there. But for me, if that was me, I'd be like, but this is better. I can start again. So why didn't they start again?
So soon after the Pilgrims arrive, another religious group called the Puritans, they will arrive, and they're going to settle in the Boston area. And the Pilgrims and the Puritans, not the same religion, and they didn't necessarily get along very well. And so I think once you get the Puritans settling so close and up in the Boston area, I think people that were very true to their Pilgrim faith, they didn't work and play well together, these two groups. But there were people who will move up to the Boston area. They don't move up as a whole group, but there are individuals who do move up into the Boston area, and they are buried in the Boston area.
Okay. So that goes to the next question, is that you talked about the Puritans, and we've got the Pilgrims, but then another faith came, which was the Quakers. Now, why did the Pilgrims and the Puritans persecute the Quakers? Because I thought they came over for freedom of religion, but they were squashing the poor Quakers.
Yes, the idea with the Pilgrims and the Puritans, they were all about freedom of religion for themselves and their faith, but not necessarily for anybody else. Now, the Quakers had a completely different philosophy. Their philosophy, and they're called the Society of Friends. They believed in being friends to everyone, and that's what, they wanted to do. And because of that, they were welcoming of all faiths. And it was that difference of theology that really puts them at odds with these other religions, because they didn't want the Quakers because, wow, the Quakers, they like all of these other religions, and we don't like them. And, it was this idea that we're the only ones going to heaven and everybody else is going to a very dark place. And yeah, and so it was that idea. And so they were very much about freedom of religion, but only for themselves.
Okay, because I thought that was really, that's
Seems
what really
odd.
got me.
Yeah.
I'm like, what was all that about? So after the Mayflower settled 56 years later, so families are starting to develop, and they're getting bigger and bigger in the area. And so the first generation of the Pilgrims wanted more land because they, like I said, they were expanding. And to get that, they were buying land of the Native Americans.
Yes.
But things went a little bit sour, and there was a war.
Yes.
So for me, it's like, why did they go to war, the next generation of Pilgrims, when the first ones were trying to be at peace with the
Native Americans? I think the first generations developed this friendship, especially through that first year that they were here, where their survival depended upon the Native Americans. And if the Native Americans hadn't taught them how to get good crops in the sandy soil and helped them so much those first 1 and 2 years, it might have been a very, very different story. And but you get the generation removed, and where they didn't have that personal experience, and to them, they saw this beautiful land, and they didn't see it as being used to the full extent that it could be. Because Native Americans, they lived off the land. Even though in this area they did plant crops and they were harvesting crops, but this idea of ownership of land was such a European idea coming in, whereas it was not a Native American idea.
Okay.
So to them, it really was. It was about, we want to own this land, and the Native Americans didn't necessarily see things the same way.
So in the war, they would capture the poor Native Americans, and But then they would sell them into slavery in the West Indies. Now, I didn't know about that. I'm like, really, they were doing it then?
Yes.
But it was, but then they went to Africa as well. Did you know, it mentions that they went to Africa, they were sent to Africa.
I was going to say, the reason they were selling them into slavery is they worried that if they just pushed them off the land and forced them to leave, that they would just keep coming back. So they wanted to actually get rid of them and move them. And some, with some of the people, their Christian beliefs of, we can't just go in and massacre all of them because that, that's just not going to be cool. And so this idea of, well, we're not killing them and we're going to make some money off of them because we're going to sell them as slaves. And so it's really difficult to judge people from that time period based on the values that we have today. Because today we would hope that those things, of course, would not happen. But back then, it was a little bit different story.
Yeah. So when reading this book, the thing that sort of struck me at the very end was I felt sorry for the Native Americans because this was their land. Us horrible Europeans came over, took over, pushed them as far as they could, and they did it over centuries. Just kept pushing them and pushing them and pushing them, all because of greed.
Yes.
At the end of the day, it was all about greed. I want land.
Yes.
And wealth. Yes. Forget about you. And I just feel sorry for them, and I'm just like, some things haven't changed.
That is true. It is. I agree with you. And it is something that you will see, continue to happen. One of the things I kind of teach my students as we go forward through this is the Europeans were illegal immigrants. The Native Americans were the ones that owned the land, and the Europeans didn't necessarily have permission to be there. In fact, many times they were said, no, we don't want you here, and they're like, too bad we're here. Part of the problem was, in Europe, all of the land had been claimed either by the nobility or the church. And so if there were people that did want land, there wasn't any available. And so this idea of the more land you have, the more power you have. So you come to the New World and you can have land, and the more land you acquire, the more power you get. And it was about greed and power and wealth, and the Native Americans were seen as savages, and we can do more with this land, and we deserve it more because of their faith.
You saying something did remind me something that I was really surprised about, that in the very early times of the Pilgrims, they started a college, university, Harvard.
Yes, they did.
And they had Native Americans in the school learning English.
Yes, they did.
And they were called the praying, what were they called? The praying, I've forgotten now.
I cannot remember either.
But these Native Americans were willing to go to this school to learn English. Yes. And they became interpreters later on.
Yes, they did.
And they helped the Europeans to communicate with the Native Americans different languages, because they all had their different tribe languages. So I thought that was very interesting that they had Native Americans in Harvard.
They did. And but the thing is a lot of times these Native Americans would convert to Christianity.
Yeah.
And so the idea is, we're gonna convert you to the true faith, is how these Europeans. Harvard was a Puritan university, and so they saw this as, the true religion, and so they wanted to make sure that, they converted them. Yeah.
For those who love history, I would recommend this book. It was a really good read. The author did a very good job with all the records that he was able to get hold of, and it wasn't one-sided or the other, it was very equal balanced, and I thought it was very good. So if you got in the summertime and you got some time, read the Mayflower. It was really good. And I want to say thank you to Des for helping me out.
You are welcome. I
Okay.
love the book.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.